Okay, no, good morning. Oh, no, wait a minute. Good evening. There you go. Second time lucky. Good evening. Oh, it's a bit loud, isn't it? Well, welcome, everyone. Welcome to the second taster here for Scotland Bible School. You are so welcome. So exciting to see so many faces. And I'm really excited for tonight. I'm really just hopeful. I think that the Lord's really going to speak in kind of new ways through his words and really open up our eyes and just set more expectation of how much we can really see and understand in the word. So we're going to go through the book of Hebrews as a wee bit of a kind of taster of what a kind of evening in a class would be like in Scotland Bible School. But I think what I'm going to do first is just pray. Always feels like a good place to start. But yeah, Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for tonight. I thank you just for each one of us that you've brought here. Lord, I thank you just for the book of Hebrews, Lord. I thank you that someone wrote down this beautiful message, this beautiful explanation of everything that you have done, Lord. I thank you that it was written so that we can know you more. And Lord, I pray that that is how we leave tonight, that we leave knowing you more and that we are transformed by your word. Amen. In case you're not super familiar with Scotland Bible School, it is a 3-year part-time school where you will get to study every single book of the Bible. In the first year of the school, we'll go through the New Testament, the majority of the New Testament, and then in the second and the third year, we'll go through the Old Testament. And when I say you will study, I mean you will get to do it. You will get to study each book of the Bible. My job isn't to study it for you, but it's to equip you to study it for yourself. So you're going to get equipped with different tools that are so useful for you to be able to read, study, and understand the word for yourself. And in order to do this, one of the tools that you would get equipped in is something called the inductive Bible study method. Oh, there you go. So, the inductive Bible study method, I was kind of first exposed to this, trained to this about 5 or 6 years ago. And in all honesty, I think the Lord used it to really change me. I think the Lord really changed how I read, how I think, through this method. A little bit about me. I actually studied chemistry at university. Yay, chemistry. One scientist in the room. I'm a very logical thinker. Put me in a lab and I'll synthesize something for you. But give me a piece of literature and I'm just oh, crikey. I'm a survivor of higher English. I did not thrive in higher English. When you think about close reading and things like that, analyzing a piece of text, it was not a key strength of mine growing up. And then obviously you become a Christian and then you're given this book and it's this is how you get to know God. And you're oh, crikey, how do I go about this? But I think this method, the Lord really did use it just to open up my eyes to what it looks like to be a really active reader, really actively looking at what's being said and really thinking about, how can I ask questions that are really going to open this up? I think I just engage in reading in a way that I didn't before. And that's just kind of my kind of personal testimony with this and how this method has just given me, the tools and really the confidence, I think, to go in with higher expectations when I come to the Word. I think before when I read the Word, it was hopeful at best, but sometimes just thinking I've read my Bible and I'm what did I learn? What I couldn't really tell you what I just read, just really feeling out my depth and really not particularly engaging with it. And yet I do think we have the Lord, we have the Holy Spirit in us and he is revealing his word to us. And I think this method just allowed my expectation to rise and my confidence to rise and the skill set that I've been equipped with now to be able to read it has really changed how I do read. So there's kind of 3 steps. If we simplify this method down, there's 3 steps to it. And a kind of overview of them. The first one is observation. So this normally starts a slightly bigger picture. When we read a book of the Bible, we'll start bigger picture. But when we get down to the kind of detail of the text, we've got a passage open in front of us. Observation is it's literally just looking. Like you're looking and you're looking and you're looking until you really start to see what's actually being said. You know, you're looking, oh, well, who's there? And where are they? And when are they? And what's happening? And, you know, maybe you're reading a letter and you're like, okay, the author's connecting this idea with this idea. You know, or maybe it's this idea is contrasted with this idea. And you're just looking at, you know, maybe there's a list of things or the author, you know, there's questions being asked. You know, you're looking and you're looking and you're looking till you really start to see what's being said. And that's just observation. And then the next step, that once you've got a real firm foundation of what is the text actually saying, like what is the Bible actually saying here, we branch into something called interpretation. And we always want to do interpretation through the lens of like the original readers of the book. And this is when we start asking questions. You know, so, you know, maybe we're in the Gospels and we're like, well, why did Jesus react to the Pharisees that way? Or why did the Pharisees react to Jesus that way? You know, we've looked and we've seen the question and the answer, and we're going, well, Jesus answered their question, but it doesn't really feel like he answered their question, you know. So we start asking more, why would Jesus have said that? Or, you know, we're saying, well, why did the author lay the book out like this? You know, why did they seem to skip over this event but give so much detail to this one? Or why was it written in this order? Or, you know, what's the implication of this? You know, why is this significant? A really cool interpretation question I go to a lot is, well, what would I miss if this wasn't here? You know, because maybe you're thinking, this feels significant, and I'm not sure why. But if you start thinking, well, what would I be missing about God's character? Or what would I be missing about the Israelites' history? Or what would I be missing about the gospel message if this wasn't here? And that can really open things up. So we want to start asking these questions. And we always want to do it through the kind of lens and the mindset of the original audience and the original author, really getting into their shoes, as it were. And once we've done that, what we want to do is we want to try and bridge it back to our life. So, you know, something sometimes people say is when they talk about this inductive Bible study method, it's like the goal of when we read the Bible is application. But I really, truly mean that. Like when we read the Bible, I never want to just leave it with like, well, what did it mean to them? Like I want to think, no, what does this mean for me? Like how does this transform my life? How does this transform how I see God? How does this transform how I see my situation? Does this change my perspective? So, you know, the Bible wasn't necessarily written to us. You know, no book in the New Testament, no letter was written to the 21st century Glaswegian church. But, you know, the Bible was absolutely written so that we can know God and that we can be transformed into his image. So it was written for you. So there's truths in the Bible that were true for the audience it was written to, and they are absolutely true for us. And when we're able to really like boil it down and see it and get to a depth through observation, through interpretation, we're able to be like, nah, like that was true for them and it's true for me. And then you're able to start asking, right, no, actually, how should this transform my life? Like, how do, like, you know, maybe there's a truth about God revealed, a truth about his character, a truth about his faithfulness. You know, it's like, do I believe that? Like, is that changing my life right now? Does my life align with that truth of who God is? If not, like, how should I change? Like, how should I be responding to God? So the goal when we study, so the goal of studying every book of the Bible is not just that we will understand or we will know things in our head, but it is that we will walk through this method and be able to bridge it back to ourselves, and we will have transformation through the power of the Holy Spirit moving through his word. And we will use this method to study every single book of the Bible. And what it will allow us to do throughout the school is have like a whole Bible understanding. And that is just so important. And honestly, I think it has really changed my life because I feel like I've got a wee bit of a roadmap now. So when I study the Bible, like sometimes you can be a bit lost. You're like, oh, crikey, actually, where were we in Israel's history? And things happen and things are said and you go, I don't know what that is talking about. You know, but if you have a whole Bible overview understanding, then you've got a little roadmap and you're like, oh, this is happening, or God's saying this, or, you know, the Israelites are responding in this way. You're like, oh, of course they are, because I know what point of the history we're at. And like this really makes sense. So you're kind of, throughout the school, you'll piece together and build this kind of whole Bible view, like overview understanding. And the way I would kind of put it is it's almost like, brick by brick, you're laying a foundation. Like kind of brick by brick, book by book. You are laying and building a foundation as you study each book, and then you're going to lay this foundation and you're going to get equipped in a method that you'll carry on for the rest of your life. And then you'll just have this foundation and some training there to keep building. So I would say that this school is like a 3-year investment that will change your life and change your relationship with the Bible going forward. And I can say that because that's my testimony. I felt out of my depth when I read the Word, and I am privileged enough to have had the Lord lead me to do a version of this school. It was like a condensed version. I did it in 9 months, so it was just like full time. And yes, I would describe it as this, like I laid a foundation and I was equipped in a method, which meant for the last 5 years, I've just continued to build on this foundation that was laid, so that I have just the firmest foundation and structure to build my life on. So when things happen, I have a lens of the faithfulness of God's character that we can have like in a relationship with Him. But my goodness, it's strong when it's built on the Word, and that is like what this school will allow us to do. So I wanted to have a taster so that you guys could really see what each kind of week to week would look like. So we're going to study through the book of Hebrews. We're going to kind of walk through the book of Hebrews, and it will be similar to kind of a normal Tuesday night. So the classes would happen on Tuesday nights. So we'll look through some big picture, historical background or cultural information, just the types of things that we would discuss for each book as we would go through. So for Hebrews, what do we already know about Hebrews? Anybody? We are not sure who wrote it. Excellent point, Laura. So yeah, we're not sure who wrote it. Does anyone else know anything about Hebrews? Yeah, absolutely. So someone just said that it's kind of directed specifically to Christians who'd converted from Judaism. Absolutely perfect. We'll talk about that. But yeah, I would say that that's right on the money. Anything else? Pardon? Theme. Hall of Fame, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like there's a few standout bits of Hebrews that it's just like this faith-filled chapter 11. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there's a few other pieces that feel quite famous from Hebrews. Absolutely right. Any last-minute things that anyone wants to say? They want you to know that Jesus is class. Absolutely. And that's probably us over tonight. that just covers it. No, absolutely right. No, this is great. Don't worry. It wasn't, you don't have to leave now if you didn't know anything. You're here so we can all learn together. So don't worry. It's great that we already knew a few items, and absolutely right. So we can probably start with the author. That's normally the best place to start. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's anonymous. So a lot of the letters in the New Testament, they do have a kind of greeting, and it'll be like, oh, hello, Paul writing from this area or with this person or something. Hebrews doesn't have that. So it is anonymous, but we do have a bit of an idea of kind of like the person who wrote it. There's a few clues in the text as well. So this would be like observation, So in chapter 13, it does mention that they knew Timothy personally. It talks about Timothy being released from prison. So we know that the author had a bit of a personal relationship with Timothy. So Timothy was a bit of a key player in the early church and kind of followed Paul. So probably also the author knew like Paul well and things like that. So we have an idea of the kind of personal relationship that they had with Timothy. Something that we wouldn't know from just like reading in our normal translation right now is that the Greek that Hebrews is written in is quite polished. It wasn't your like run-of-the-mill common Greek. So like folk who would know a lot more than us, who are kind of language scholars, would say that Hebrew is really quite polished. So there's maybe the assumption that the person was fairly well educated and like they knew very good Greek. It's kind of like the most polished Greek in the New Testament. The New Testament was written in Greek. This was very good Greek. And something else that we could know from just reading the book is that there's a lot of Old Testament quotes in the book. And the Old Testament quotes are from what's called the Septuagint. Now, if you've not heard of the Septuagint before, absolutely fair enough. I struggle to say it. But it was basically the Old Testament, as it were, like the kind of Hebrew writing, while the Greek were the world power, they were the world power before Rome, they translated the kind of like Old Testaments, were like the Hebrew writing, into Greek. And that's called the Septuagint. So the writer of Hebrews is quoting a lot of Old Testament, but they're doing it from the Septuagint, so the Greek translation of what was like the Old Testament to like, or the just the writings and scriptures to the Jews, but to us the Old Testament. It is interesting sometimes when we read the New Testament, we think they had the whole Bible sometimes, but no, they only had. When they talk about the scriptures, they're only talking about the Old Testament. So yes, they were kind of using the Greek translation of this. So there's just like a few things that we can potentially kind of conclude from this, and something that scholars would say is it is likely that the author who wrote this was absolutely like a Jew, based on like what they are talking about. So like a Jew that has converted to Christianity. So they have a really good understanding of the Old Testament scriptures. But there's something called a Hellenistic Jew. And basically that was someone who would have grown up kind of outside of Israel, like outside of Judah and Jerusalem. And they were still a Jew, though. And it does not mean that they were any less dedicated to the Lord. An example of a Hellenistic Jew would be Saul or Paul. He grew up in Tarsus, but I mean, he was a Pharisee, absolutely zealous to the law and obedience to God. So it did not mean in any way that they were less of a Jew, but it just meant that they kind of grew up within the kind of wider Roman Empire at the time. So would have, known, say, Greek, and would have used this Septuagint. So it's just something that we can kind of like conclude through different things. So we don't know who wrote it necessarily, but we can kind of piece together a few kind of clues as to who this person would have been like. And there are a few options. One option is Paul. People would say that this isn't super likely, just because Paul, he never really shied away from anything. If he was saying something, his name was on it. He wrote what he thought. And obviously, Hebrews isn't signed. The writing is kind of laid out and structured, kind of worded a wee bit differently than some of the things that he would be writing as well. So it is an option, but a lot of people would say that it probably wasn't Paul. Another option that has been thrown out is Barnabas. Barnabas was kind of on Paul's missionary journey, his first missionary journey. He travelled with him. So he has been thrown out as an option. He was very well known to the early church. It kind of comes up in a couple of places in Acts. So he's been thrown out as an option. Also, we have Apollos. So Apollos is someone we come across in Acts in chapter 19, and he's actually described as an eloquent man, competent in the scriptures. Now, when we read the book of Hebrews, I think the author was eloquent and competent in scriptures. So he's ticking some boxes, I think, but just because, yes, like the description that we have of him in Acts is that he would kind of fill in this. He was actually a Jew, he was from Alexandria, so he would have been described as kind of more of a Hellenistic Jew and things like that, so would have probably also known about this Septuagint. So he is an option that people would throw out. We come across him in Acts. Another option has been thrown out is Silas. Silas actually wrote 1 Peter. He's like the scribe that's named in the end of 1 Peter, so we know he could write Greek. That Greek wasn't as well polished, but did travel with Paul, would have known Timothy, travelled around, so they would have known one another. So again, a few boxes being ticked by Silas. And the last one that we know is an option is our old Priscilla. I know. So Priscilla, if you've read Acts before, we come across her and her husband Aquila in Corinth. So they're tent makers, They were originally from Rome, but ended up in Corinth. We'll talk about that in a wee second. And they come across Paul, so they're ministering with him, and they are like tent makers together. And then actually, when we come across Apollos, he's eloquent, kind of versed in the scriptures, as it were. But he didn't have like a full understanding of the gospel, so it wasn't like quite preaching fully, like the fullness of it. So Aquila and Priscilla actually kind of pull him aside, give him the full explanation of what Christ had done, and then he continued out and continued preaching. So he was eloquent and competent in scriptures, and they were the ones to help him understand better the gospel. So I would say that the two of them were probably competent in scriptures and potentially eloquent as well. It's been thrown out as an option. Some people might say that that's why it's anonymous, just because it would have been a female writer. She would have been known to the kind of Roman church and the kind of church throughout the empire. So, it's been thrown out. We have no idea. We know like a handful of things about the person, based on some of the things that I've talked about, whether it's just observing the text or looking at some of the language and things. So, you can conclude if you feel particularly confident in one of these authors, but I don't think we need to do that tonight. But there are quite a few options, and this is the book of the Bible, kind of one book of the Bible where the list kind of does go on. Most of the other ones, it's pretty well concluded who the author was. So Hebrews is a bit of a funny one for that. But yeah, there are a handful of options there. Pop them all out there. But one thing that I think we also do know about the author is that they quite liked sailing, because there's quite a lot of like sailing metaphors and images, like lest we drift away, like hope to anchor, So I always do a little bit of a theme in my PowerPoint presentations. So I don't know if you've noticed or not, but there are a few, every picture's a boat. But yeah, so if anyone likes sailing, you're welcome. If not, I just focus on the text that's on the screen rather than the pictures. But yeah, I just thought that'd be fun. They seem to like sailing. Anyways, so who was it written to? Belinda's already said a great point, that it is very likely that it was written to specifically like Jewish Christians. So converts from Judaism to Christianity. Now, the title Hebrews wasn't actually like given to the letters as well, probably till about the 2nd century. But absolutely, just from the content of the letter, we can really assume that it would have been Jewish converts to Christianity, because the author really does seem to assume that they have quite an extensive understanding of the Old Testament. In particular, what I would call the Pentateuch, so those first 5 books of the Bible, like how Moses led them out of Egypt to Mount Sinai, how they received the law, the Levitical priesthood, the sacrificial system. The author is assuming that they have quite an extensive understanding of that. If you don't feel like you have an extensive understanding of the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system, don't worry, we will chat about that tonight. But yeah, the author kind of assumes that they are going to know, otherwise the content of the letter wouldn't really make sense to them. So we can kind of assume that it absolutely would have been like kind of Jewish Christians. There are a couple of other kind of clues from the text of who they were. So specifically in chapter 2, verse 3, it talks about how like the Lord, like Jesus brought this gospel message, and then like those who heard it then shared it. So it seems like this church and who it was written to wouldn't have maybe like heard Jesus, met Jesus, and heard the gospel message from him specifically, but it would have almost been through like evangelism. Those who first heard, whether it was the apostles or just those who heard, have shared what they heard, and now this church has believed and been formed through their message. So it kind of seems like 2nd generation believers. And also, we can see that they have suffered some affliction. So when we look at chapter 10, verse 32 to 34, it does talk about how they have suffered some approach, some affliction. It talks about maybe like the theft of property. It does mention imprisonment, that they kind of been standing with them. So yeah, it does seem like they have absolutely faced some backlash for their faith. Although it hasn't escalated to what the kind of severity of persecution that would one day come to the church. So we'll talk about that as well. Something else that is said in the end of the letter is the author is saying those who come from Italy send their greetings. So what some people, there's a couple of theories that could kind of be pulled from this, but one kind of option is that the author has known kind of the Italian church, the Roman church, has maybe been part of it, is now out of Rome, and there are Roman believers, there are Italian believers around them who are sending their greetings back to Italy, if that makes sense. So there is definitely a relationship with the Italian church, probably with the Roman church, and it seems potential that the author is like with believers from Rome, outside of Rome, and they're sending their greetings back to Italy, like back to Rome. So there's a kind of couple of, maybe the author's writing kind of from Rome to Rome. I think it does make sense that this letter was written to the kind of Roman church, or certainly like kind of the wider church within the empire, but they definitely do have a relationship with the Italian Roman church, like the author, the audience, etc. So that's kind of something that we can also kind of imply from some of the pieces of the letter. Does that make sense? Lots of nods. That's great. So another question that we like to ask is, when was it written? So I've got a wee timeline that will pop up. There's some key dates that help us piece this together. So something that happened in 70 AD was that the temple was destroyed. Now, skipping ahead a little bit, something that's mentioned a lot in this letter is the kind of end to the priesthood and the sacrificial system that at the time was happening in the temple. Now, if the author was saying, guys, the sacrificial system has come to an end, Jesus has brought in a new way, it would make sense that they would say the sacrificial system no longer applies to us, and anyways, temple's gone, it's not happening anymore. But the author doesn't say that. Implication being that the temple had not been destroyed yet. Because if you're making an argument as to why the sacrificial system no longer applies, it would make sense to add that into the argument, that the temple is no longer there. Therefore, my assumption, many people's conclusion would be that the temple had not yet been destroyed. Therefore, the letter would have been written before 70 AD. I know, that makes sense, doesn't it? So, like, yeah, it feels a wee bit like a conspiracy theory, you know what I mean? You've just got all these different dates on it, but it does make sense. So that was something in 70 AD, so we can really assume that the letter was written before that, okay? And something else that happened a wee bit earlier on is in 49 AD, the emperor at the time was Claudius, and Claudius kicked all the Jews out of Rome. Now, this is significant just generally in that kind of time, and it makes a lot of things make sense if we know that. And it's actually mentioned specifically in the Bible because Aquila and Priscilla were in Rome, they had to leave, and that's why Paul met them in Corinth, in Greece. But what that meant was that the church for like 5 years or so was only Gentile in Rome. And when I say Gentile, I just mean that a Jew, like an Israelite, was someone who descended from Abraham, who was in the promise made to Abraham, and they were an Israelite, they were a Jew, and everyone else is a Gentile. So if you've not heard that language before, a Jew was a descendant of Abraham, and everyone else not in that bloodline is a Gentile. So if you don't have Jewish heritage in you, you're a Gentile. I'm a Gentile convert to Christianity. And what happened was that for a good few years, about 5 years, the Jews all had to leave Rome. Then they were allowed to come back, and the church in Rome had been kind of ran by Gentiles for like 5 years or so. And then what happened was that you've got Gentile, you've got Jew, you've got two very different cultures, very different worldviews, very different mindsets, very different priorities, and there's a bit of like disunity when the church comes back together. And Romans is written. And a main theme in Romans is unity, because the church was really struggling at the time. So Romans is written about 55 AD. Now, at no mention in Romans is there persecution, really. So the assumption would be that there wasn't really persecution facing the church at that time in Rome and in Italy and generally in the empire at that moment. But there was like some unity issues, hence why the letter would have been written. However, in 64 AD, there was a fire, the Great Fire of Rome. Now, The emperor at the time of that was a chap called Nero. And what is thought is potentially Nero started the fire. Now, either way, if he started the fire or if he didn't, he benefited from it because he wanted to do up the city, and this fire allowed him to do it. However, he did face a little bit of backlash over this fire. He needed a scapegoat. Come in the Christians. He went, I'll blame the Christians. So this great fire happened in about 64 AD. Whether it was Nero specifically doing it or not, like intentionally, he did benefit from it, faced a bit of backlash, blamed the Christians. Thus started quite a widespread persecution against the Christians that lasted a few years. And in that time, Paul and Peter are known to have been martyred. Now that was about 67, 68 AD. So at first the persecution was a bit lighter, but it did get to the point where it was absolutely horrendous. Christians would have been burned as torches in the street at garden parties. They would have been put in the Colosseum with wild animals to be killed, or they would have been put in the Colosseum and made to watch their families face these wild animals. So they were burned at the stake, they were beheaded, they were crucified. So the persecution that rose after this fire to the Christians escalated to real severe persecution. But it did take a couple of years to kind of get up to that point. So what people would say is that there is some affliction, there is some persecution being faced by the church, that like the audience that this book was written to. However, it's not described as being where it would have been about 67, 68 AD. So people would say that it was maybe written around 65 AD. And then what that means is it was after the Great Fire in Rome, but it was before the persecution rose to what it became in about 67, 68. And this is when we find like Peter, Paul, and some other significant apostles like being killed for their faith. So yes, that's in and around where people would date this letter. So quite a lot we can actually piece together about this letter that doesn't have a specific audience mentioned, a specific author mentioned, a specific date. We can still piece things together quite a lot just from reading the book, and then just going to a few extra kind of like outer biblical, kind of reputable sources, we're able to piece together quite a lot more as well. So the next question I would like to ask is, like, why was this letter written? So in the beginning, Christianity was kind of seen as a bit of a like sect of Judaism. You know, it was kind of a group of people within Judaism who believed that Jesus was the Messiah that they'd been waiting for. But in Acts 11, verse 26, where at this point we're talking about the church in Antioch. This is just a place just a little north of Israel. And Acts 11 says that it was in this place that the disciples were first called Christians. And this really started the kind of split where it was Judaism and Christianity, and a new religion was kind of starting and being made. And this was in and around about 40 AD. So it did take a few years to kind of get to that point. And at the time of writing, Christianity was illegal. Judaism was legal. So Christianity was new. It was radical. People are saying allegiance to King Jesus. You know, the Romans, that Nero, like everyone had to think of Nero as king, Nero as God, and that they're saying Jesus is God, Jesus is king, and it was brand new, and it was radical, and it was scary to the Roman Empire. So Christianity was illegal at the time of writing. Judaism was legal. Judaism had been around for generations and generations, and at this point, Jews were scared. Like, they were scared of going into another exile. They were scared of God and the consequences that come from disobeying the law. So, you know, Jews at that point held to the law with such high obedience. You know, they put, the religious teachers at the time put laws around the laws. They created new laws to make sure that no one accidentally broke laws. You know, this was the kind of level of obedience that they sought after. And within the empire, you know, Jews were excluded from military service because they would not break the Sabbath. Like, they would rather die rather than break the Sabbath, because it was that level of kind of fear of breaking the law. And what that meant was that I think it was almost one of those ones of like, sometimes it's just not worth the fight. So Jews were kind of allowed some level of religious freedom because they would not bow down to idols, they would not break the Sabbath, etc. So there was some level of religious freedom that a Jew got. They were looked down upon, like they absolutely were looked down upon. Like it was still not good to be a Jew, but there was some level of religious freedom and there was some level of protection because it had been so well known for generations. Christianity was new, it was radical, and Rome was scared of it. And what happened was that, this fire started, Christianity was illegal and mass persecution was starting against the Christians. However, if you were a Jew who had converted to Christianity, you had a figurative fire escape. You could maybe carry on professing your faith to Jesus in the comfort of your own home and the safety of your own home, but out in the public you could say, I'm a Jew. Like you could get the protection of the synagogue. So as this persecution is rising, they had the option of saying, oh no, I'm a Jew, I can get protected by the synagogue, I'm not going to face the same level of persecution that just these Christians are getting. However, the author asks the question, at what cost? And therefore they write this letter really explaining the cost of doing that. So the author goes through this logical progression showing how Jesus is truly better, and then goes on to challenge the audience to stay faithful to Jesus despite persecution. So this is the situation that it was written to. Christians that have converted to Judaism that have a real option of claiming safety, like a real good escape, to be able to ride the persecution through. But the author is saying Jesus is better, he has made a better way. There is danger in you doing that, and there is a far greater option that Jesus has opened for us. And then they write this letter kind of explaining that. So that's kind of why the letter would have been written. And I think so to understand the letter and what was written and why it was written, we do need to understand the mindset of Jewish believers and Jewish Christians. Because they had their worldview, they had their culture, they had all of their understanding of God rooted in the Old Testament. So for us to really understand what the author was saying and why they were saying it, we need to have a similar understanding of the Old Testament. So the first thing that's kind of helpful to talk about to understand kind of their mindset is covenants. Now, covenants was kind of how God established and formed his relationship with Israel. They kind of grew, their relationship grew through covenants. And a covenant is really just a kind of formal relationship agreement. It's like marriage is a covenant. And the author of Hebrews refers to 3 specific covenants that God had made with his people throughout the Bible. God made more covenants, but he kind of refers to 3 specific ones. So the first one that he talks about is the Abrahamic covenant. Now, there was a covenant with Abraham. God made a promise to Abraham. We find this in Genesis 12. Despite Abraham being an old man, he had no children, God promises that he is going to have descendants. He's going to become a great nation, that all nations are going to be blessed through him. He promises him a land. God promised him a lot of things in Genesis 12. So people might call this covenant a promissory covenant, or also an unconditional covenant. And what I mean by that is that God took sole responsibility for all of these promises being fulfilled. Abraham and his descendants didn't have any responsibility. There was no kind of part of the bargain, as it were, that they had to keep in order for these promises to be fulfilled. So God makes this promise to Abraham, Genesis 12. It is formalized in a covenant in Genesis 15. And then this covenant is referred to in Hebrews at the end of chapter 6. And the sign of this covenant, covenants often had a sign, the sign of this covenant was circumcision. So when the Israelites would get circumcised, that was them saying, I'm part of this covenant, I'm part of this promise that God has made to Abraham, that they will be a great nation, that they will have a land, and that all nations will be blessed by them. So this is this first covenant that God made with Abraham. Like, he's made a couple of covenants before. There's more covenants in between. But this is one covenant that God had made with Abraham. Now, he makes another covenant with his people. It's sometimes called the Mosaic covenant, but it is absolutely made with like the whole of Israel. And it's made hundreds of years after the Abrahamic covenant. And it's the start of the fulfillment of this promise. So God made this promise to Abraham that they're going to be a great nation, they're going to have a land, and Israel were enslaved in Egypt. They were led out by Moses, and they were taken to Mount Sinai, and this is where Israel, who is now a nation, a whole nation, receives the law. And God establishes another covenant with them, like another relationship, like kind of develops their relationship even more with another covenant. Now, this covenant was not unconditional. This covenant was conditional. And what that means is that there were kind of conditions attached to this covenant for the promises being made to be fulfilled. So God promises blessing. He says, right, this land, I promised Abraham, I'm taking you into it. This is like Fiona's paraphrase version of the Bible, by the way. See that land over there? I am taking you in it. No, that's not how it's said. That's not how it's actually said in Exodus. But yeah, so God says, there's going to be a land. I'm taking you into it. Says that to Abraham. Israel are now going into the land. And he says, see, when you're in there, there's going to be fruitfulness. There's going to be a good harvest. There's going to be peace from the other nations. It's going to rain when you need it to rain. Like, there's just going to be peace. There's going to be prosperity if they obey God. However, if they disobey God, if they disobey his laws, there are consequences. Like, if they don't hold up their end of the bargain, as it were, then there's going to be curses. There's going to be disease. There's going to be drought. There's going to be famine. Other nations are going to come against them. There's going to be death. And eventually they're going to be deported. They're going to be exiled out of their land somewhere else if they do not keep the covenant. So this covenant was established with the whole nation of Israel at Mount Sinai, and it's like the laws were the terms and conditions of this covenant. And God says if they obey the law, he's going to protect them. He's forming a relationship with them. I'm going to be your protector. I'm going to be your provider. I'm going to be your king. I'm going to look after you. And their role in this relationship was to obey. And if they did, it was going to be great. There was going to be blessings. And if they didn't, then there'd be consequences. And generation after generation, Israel disobeyed. They broke the covenant, and eventually they were exiled from their land. We read this in Kings and we read it in Chronicles. But in God's grace, he brought them back to the land, and there was a remnant of Israel, this kind of small portion of Israel, who were waiting for the Messiah to come and to save them for hundreds of years. And this covenant was still like their binding relationship until Jesus came. And this covenant, like Hebrews makes it clear that it was a temporary covenant. Like Galatians calls the law a guardian, like Israel's guardian, until Christ came. So it's this kind of temporary covenant. And it was the law, and it was the old covenant, this Mosaic covenant, that established the priesthood and the sacrificial system. Now, the sacrificial system was how Israel were to worship God. They were to atone for sin. They were to cleanse themselves. And it was the priesthood that were to facilitate the sacrificial system. And it was the tabernacle where it was supposed to happen. So the tabernacle is basically just a tent, but a very special tent. And the design for the tabernacle was given by God to Moses, and in the wilderness, it was made exactly as God commanded. So the sacrificial system was how Israel worshipped God, atoned for sin, cleansed themselves, like all of this. And it happened in the tabernacle, and it was the priests, the priesthood, that were the facilitators of it. And the tabernacle itself has a few different layers to it. If anyone likes the tabernacle and you want to chat about it more, I'm available. I love talking about the tabernacle. But the tabernacle had layers. Okay, so there's the outer courts of the tabernacle, and this is where the bronze altar was. And if you were maybe bringing a Thanksgiving offering, or if you were just like different offerings that Israel were to do, they were to bring it to the courts. The bronze altar was there so people could kind of slightly more come and go of that area. Then you've got the holy place. And the holy place was where the priests were allowed to go. And they kind of ministered to the Lord daily there. So they had an incense offering altar. And the bread of the presence was there, if you've heard of that before. It's mentioned a couple of times. So the priests were allowed to go there, and they did daily duties to minister to the Lord. And in the very center of the tabernacle was the most holy place. This is where the Ark of the Covenant was, like where the mercy seat was. This was where the presence of, like, this is where God said he would kind of reside, his presence would be. And it was only the high priest that was allowed to go in there once a year, and he atoned for the sins of the people like him and the people, and he atoned for sin, and he was only allowed to go there and there like once a year. So it was kind of like as you go closer to the center, like the holiness and the presence of God was there, and like there was curtains that kind of blocked off each area, and it's like real reverence, like as you go like into the center of the tabernacle. So it's kind of this 3 layers. And the priesthood, so these are the ones that are facilitating this covenant and sacrificial system and all that's happening. They were the ones who were descendants of Aaron, so Moses' brother. And they were from the tribe of Levi, so they were the Levites. And Levi was one of the 12 sons of Jacob. So anyone who descended from Levi was a Levite. And specifically Moses and Aaron were Levites. So that was the tribe who were kind of ordained in the service of the Lord. And it all kind of happened after the golden calf incident. So the golden calf incident. So the golden calf incident occurs in the old chapter 32 of Exodus. And Moses comes down from the Mount Sinai. And he's like, what's going on? And eventually he's like, who's with the Lord? And then it's the tribe of Levi. They're like, we're with the Lord. And so they were ordained that day for the service of the Lord. And so within that tribe, any descendants of Aaron were the priesthood, and everyone was a Levite from that tribe, and they were like to minister to the Lord. But it was only the priests that were allowed to go in and do certain jobs. So it's kind of like all the priests were Levites, but not every Levite was a priest, if that makes sense. I don't know why the hip went, but it did. So the book of Leviticus was written specifically to the Levites. It took me far too long to realize that. Like, Leviticus was written to the tribe of Levi. Alex is having this moment now. It was written to the priesthood, and it detailed how they were supposed to carry out these offerings, the sacrifices, the Lord, like on behalf of the people. It details how they're supposed to give thanksgiving offerings, atone for sin, just ensure the camp stayed clean. I mean, there's information about leprosy, about mold in your house. It was really an instruction manual. But the center of the book, the kind of real main thing of the book, is the Day of Atonement. And this was the day when the high priest went into the most holy place. It was a really somber day, and he atoned for the sin of the people. And it was to be taken incredibly seriously. Leviticus even details when Aaron's 2 sons go in and they offer unauthorized fire, and they die immediately. So following the law really was life and death, specifically for the priesthood, but also for the people of Israel, because many consequences to sin was death. Not just spiritually, but like physically. That was the consequence of their sin. And all of this, like all I've just said, was like common knowledge to the audience. Like, this was their own personal history. This would have been so real to them. And the author is using the pieces of this covenant, this Mosaic covenant, the Old Covenant, the earthly high priest, the descendants from Aaron, the earthly tabernacle, the sacrificial system, like to contrast all of this with Jesus when he came to really explain who he was, what he did, and the significance of it, and the new covenant that he brought in. So the final covenant that the author talks about is the new covenant. And this is the one that Jesus brought in as he fulfilled all of these promises that had been made throughout the Old Testament. Like, he fulfills all these different covenants. And the author is showing how much better this new covenant is. And again, it was a promissory covenant. It was an unconditional covenant. So God has been planning this covenant for so long. And for this to be fulfilled, it is not dependent on the believer. It was not dependent on the original reader to do anything. It was that the Lord would have done this. So it's this promissory covenant, like it was all on man, like God, all on God, like man didn't have the kind of responsibility to make these promises be fulfilled. So this really built all together, for like especially like this, the kind of old covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant. This really built for the mindset of the audience, and something specific that maybe like some of us can relate to, maybe some of us can't so easily, is that the audience and this like the Jewish believers at the time had a real like fear of God. Like to them, like God was quite unapproachable, and he was to be feared. I mean, we see this when the law was given. They received the law, they're at Mount Sinai, and, Moses is kind of mediating, kind of speaking to God on behalf of them. And they're literally like, you go up the mountain and speak to God, or we will die. Like, they saw God, they saw his presence, and they saw his glory. And, there was a real awareness in them that day, and it was like they were afraid of God, and this really did bleed down throughout the generations, in particular after exile and as they returned, and then when we come to like Jesus's time, there was a real fear of disobeying the law. There was a real fear of God, and God was still often seen as really unapproachable. We kind of see this, like they wouldn't even say like the name of God. Like God revealed his name to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus, Yahweh. And they wouldn't even say that. They were afraid to say his name. So they would replace his name with just like Lord. So they would say Adonai. That was like the Hebrew word for Lord. So they would say that instead of saying like his actual like, Yahweh, the kind of, who was, who is, and will kind of forever be, always be. Not because there was any lack of reverence for God, but just because they were so, kind of afraid of him. So this was kind of like the mindset of the audience. Oh no. Oh, praise. We find this that often they thought that like God would speak through mediators, like God wouldn't really speak directly to them. We have this in the prophets. We kind of have this like Moses was kind of speaking through them because he was just this kind of unapproachable situation. But their relationship really had been kind of bound and secured and developed through these covenants. This was like a real kind of Jewish mindset, as it were, for God. Now, just a couple more things that are kind of unique to Hebrews. So we've kind of already talked about it, but it really does. It details the priesthood and it details the law and brings it through to some New Testament application, which is just so cool to read. But this is quite unique. Like, not every book in the New Testament, like the letters, were written to Jewish specific believers. So this is a really unique message. This is a really unique book that really does pull through the Old Testament into the New, the kind of Old Covenant into the New Covenant. If an author was writing to a church that were primarily Gentile, often they're writing about how to overcome, witchcraft or immoral living or, unity issues if there was a blend of a church or something like that. Like, this is a really unique book in the way that it's unveiling these kind of Old Testament promises and covenants and different aspects of the Jewish faith, like into New Testament application. It's really cool. And because of that, it's got loads of Old Testament scriptures quoted in it. So quite a lot from the Psalms in particular. And my little tip is, see when you see an Old Testament piece in scripture, it's really good to go back and actually read the kind of context around it. Because often the Jews knew it. They would know those first 5 books of the Bible. They would know the stories. They would know the scripture. They would know the Psalms, just like off by heart in a way that we don't really today. So often, if a little piece is quoted in a book, if a Jew was reading that, it's like their mind would just all of a sudden kind of screed through the whole of the Psalm or something like that. So often, it's very helpful if we pop back and we actually read the context of it. So there's a wee top tip. If you're ever reading Hebrews and or anything with Old Testament references, very helpful to read the whole bit. So something else that's kind of unique to the old Hebrews is something called typology. or types. Now, this is a figure of speech. I think we're quite we're kind of Western and like Greek mindset. We're very literal people often. So like when we read the Bible, not often is a question that we ask like, oh, is this literal or figurative? You know, we very quickly just assume literal. I mean, that's an issue sometimes I have. Yeah, I don't know. Anyone else? Anyone else? It's not a question often that we think, oh, is this literal or figurative? But actually, quite a lot of the time, there is some figurative kind of techniques used in writing. And it's good to be able to spot. And sometimes something that's used is types. And basically, this is just like prefigures or foreshadowing something to come or someone to come. So it's kind of like a symbol. So maybe like an Old Testament thing that's used to better explain a New Testament thing. So for example, the Passover lamb. The Passover lamb would be like a type for the sacrifice that Jesus made. He was our Passover lamb. Now, best thing to do when we're trying to figure out figures of speech is the Bible often explicitly calls them that. So for example, for the Passover lamb, in case we go down some rabbit trail of like wild interpretation, 1 Corinthians 5 specifically says that Jesus was our Passover lamb. So we'll have read that before and noticed this type, you know, and we will have noticed this kind of technique that an author has used by him being called our Passover lamb and being able to go to the Old Testament, but we might not have been trained in actually how to use what we've seen. We won't even have realized we've seen something and we won't know how to use it. But actually, this is used quite a lot in the Bible, where there's something from the Old Testament that's kind of been foreshadowing something that Jesus was going to do. Because Jesus was always going to do what he was going to do, but the Lord in his grace gave pieces of the Old Testament so that they would bring greater understanding when Jesus came. And types is just like a figure of speech that we're able to now like kind of observe and interpret. So for example, in Hebrews, Melchizedek is mentioned. Now, Melchizedek is introduced in Genesis 14, so the chapter right before the covenant is made with Abraham. And he was a priest. However, he was not a priest from the Levitical priesthood, mainly because Levi wasn't even born yet. So Melchizedek was a few generations before. He had no genealogy kind of mentioned. His death isn't recorded. He was a priest and a king of Salem that like eventually became Jerusalem. And his name meant peace. So Jesus isn't Melchizedek. Melchizedek isn't Jesus. But like the author is kind of using this, and it's all kind of based because there was a scripture from the Old Testament that said that he was going to be a priest in like the line of Melchizedek. So there's kind of this specific thing, and the author's kind of using it and explaining it, just to give us a better understanding of the role that Jesus actually like fulfilled, and what he actually did. So it's not like necessary to really understand the fullness of like these figures of speech and things, but when we're equipped in them, like when we know to look for them, when we know how to use them, there's a level of understanding that we can get from using the Old Testament to understand the New, to use the New to understand the Old, and we might get to a depth that we otherwise couldn't get to. So that's kind of like an example of something that is kind of throughout Hebrews and is within the Bible. But again, when we're using our figures of speech, it is excellent when the Bible explicitly says it, so we have confidence when we are trying to interpret it and kind of understand them. So that's kind of a couple of kind of unique aspects of Hebrews. Now, I've been talking for far too long. So what I would like you to do is take a breath, turn to the person next to you, little partner up. It can be a 3 if you need it to be a 3. But is there something that you have learned? Is there something you've just found interesting? Has there maybe been a question that you had coming in tonight that's now been answered? Or something along those lines? Share with your partner. Reflect on what we've just talked about. If one person shared, make sure the other person also gets a wee chance. Okie dokies. Would anyone like to share anything cool that they have realised or anything that came up in their share time? Share time? Yeah. But basically, yeah, actually I do. Nah, that's cool. Anyone else? Anything else come up? Oh, yes, Rita. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a letter that helps that we can know quite a bit about who it was written to. Because again, we can't even say, oh, a specific church in a specific location, but we can be like, okay, well, this was the situation though. Like we can really read what's being said, we can kind of read between the lines, and we can piece a lot together. But yeah, there is quite a lot of ambiguity with this letter in particular. Like, kind of the most so in the New Testament in particular. But yeah, we'll find out in heaven, I guess. First question to ask. Anything else? Does anyone want to share anything else? Oh, Duncan, yeah, absolutely.
We like the timeline a bunch, but also the context of the Jewish people being so fearful of God. I've never quite thought of the fact that the New Testament is they're really only recently back out of exile,
Mm-hmm.
and they're in that place of not trusting God. I think my mind's back in Old Testament where they're just doing their own thing, they don't care.
Yeah.
But no, actually, because they're so fearful of another exile. I don't think I've quite thought that through before.
Mm-hmm. No, it's really interesting to think of the mindset and like the relationship with God that's developed from like with Israel kind of throughout the generations. Because so often it does kind of help us understand why they're doing what they're doing. So yeah, no, that's a really good point. So yeah, any other any questions that's come up? Anybody want to ask anything? Not sure about? Bit of a whistle stop tour through the Old Testament there. No, smashing. Sorry. Okay. Righty-ho. Well, let's crack on and think type of literature. This is something we'll talk about a lot in the school. Honestly, for me personally, absolutely opened up reading the Bible for me. I feel like it's kind of obvious when you say it, but it's like, there's so many different types of like genre of literature in the Bible, and you're going to read a narrative. You're going to read a story so differently than you are going to read a poem like a psalm. You're going to read it so differently than you are going to read a letter. So if we understand a little bit about how something was written, then it's going to help us know how to read it. So the type of literature, it is an epistle, like it's a fancy word for a letter. Now, a really common structure of letter writing in that day, it was like you would have a little greeting, and then you would have a kind of thanksgiving or a praise, and then you'd have the main body of the letter, and then you'd have a wee farewell. So often New Testament letters really just perfectly fit into that, and there's like greeting, praise to God, the Father in heaven, etc. Main body of letter, and then a wee farewell. So it's kind of interesting. Hebrews doesn't really have the greeting or the kind of praise or thanksgiving portion. It kind of just jumps straight into the main body, just jumps straight in being like, Jesus, spoke through the prophets, spoke through the angels, here we go. Like, it's just like, in you go. So we don't really have that start. Super interesting to notice when letters are written and they miss it out. For example, Galatians, there is no thanksgiving. There is no praise. They're just like, the author's just straight in and like, hi, Paul, Galatian church, you bunch of fools, who's bewitched you? And it really sets the tone and the atmosphere for the letter. And the fact that there's praise, thanksgiving bit is mission, like actually, says a lot. And there's quite a lot that kind of adds to the tone and the atmosphere. Do you know, I actually always think, like, see, we think about it today and we like read the letters of the Bible and things, but like that was written to a church and one person would have read it out. So I'm like, did they pre-read it and being like, oh, this is a bit of a harsh rebuke? Or did they just crack it open and be like, oh, Paul's written us a letter? Wonder what he's saying? And then all of a sudden they're just like, oh, we've been bewitched. I don't actually think this one is good, guys. Let's get repenting now. Like, I don't know. But I sometimes think we just think these letters and we just read it in the Bible, like back to back or whatever. But I'm like, no, they were real people in a real situation, written, like read out to a room full of people. It was just like, you could have heard a pin drop in the Galatian church that day. They've heard that the Thessalonians got a really encouraging letter. They're like, where's our encouraging letter? No, oh crikey, sorry, I feel like I've moved into stand-up. Right. Right, so how was it written, right? We've talked about the fact it was an epistle. Really commonly in the epistles, they have theology to application. Okay, so this is a really common structure. And what it is it's like the author is explaining this beautiful thing that God has done. And then they say, therefore, this is how it should apply to your life. Now, it's just a really common way that the New Testament kind of letters are written. You'll find like Ephesians does this. It's like this perfect like theology portion, and it's like, praise God, amen, therefore, and goes on. Romans is a bit similar. Hebrews is the same. So we've kind of got this structure here, and so it's like chapter 10, 18. It's kind of the end of the theology portion. And then you move chapter 10, 19 to the end of the letter into some application. So if nothing else, this is a really good point to say that chapter breaks don't always come at the best time. So if you ever read something and you think, oh, I feel like I'm in the middle of a thought if I stop here, great observation. Just read till the thought's over. Well done. But yes, so in Hebrews, it kind of is broken up and it's kind of got Jesus, this kind of like this idea that he has brought this better covenant. There's this explanation as to why his covenant and the new covenant that he has brought is better. And then it kind of goes on to right, how can you live a better life? How can this apply into your life? So this is this kind of theology to application portion. Now, the theology portion can kind of be broken up into a few different wee sections, one of which is this kind of like, he's the better messenger. So Jesus is better than angels, he's better than Moses. Jesus brought a better message. A wee bit of a Jewish tradition was that Moses received the law from angels. Like God gave the law to angels, who then gave it to Moses, who then gave it to the people. So sometimes when we read the start bit, like, angels, maybe it isn't actually as a common thing that we would talk about, like in the church today, whereas they kind of believed that angels were kind of mediators and had been like instrumental to the giving of the law. It's a kind of tradition that formed, so it's not specifically in the Bible at all, but it is a kind of tradition that formed out of Deuteronomy, chapter 33, verse 2. So this was kind of a teaching at the time, but the author is making it clear that Jesus has brought a better message. He's brought the gospel message. Therefore, he is a better messenger, and he also shows in this portion that he, in his message, is bringing a better rest. It talks about the rest that was on offer for the Israelites as they came out of the Exodus. They were in the wilderness, and there was the promised land, the rest to come. a rest that they had been waiting for since the beginning of creation. That God rests on the seventh day. Like there's this kind of image in comparison to that. But it makes it clear that actually, no, Jesus has brought a better rest that is possible for those who believe now. So there's this kind of better messenger that starts off the book. And then we go in, this kind of goes to the kind of, just before the end of chapter 4, and then at the start of chapter 4, at the end of chapter 4, into chapter 7, there's this kind of explanation of how he is the better high priest. So previously, it was the Levitical high priest that was established in Mount Sinai, but they were not perfect, and they could not perfect the people. They had to make sin offerings for the people, for themselves. There were so many high priests over the years because once they died, their descendant took their place. However, Jesus was perfect under the law. He was sinless, and he is eternal. Therefore, he has established an eternal covenant, and he is the eternal high priest of that covenant. So there's this kind of comparison and contrast to the old system, the old covenant, and Jesus is this new, better high priest that kind of unfolds by the end of 4 into 7. And then in 8, we start talking about the better sacrifice. So a high priest was appointed. They were appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices on behalf of the people. And the author recounts how the high priest every year would go into the most holy place and to go into the earthly tabernacle and offer sacrifices on the Day of Atonement. And this was for his and the people's unintentional sin. But it had to be repeated every year. It could never perfect anyone. It could never take away the sin of the people. Whereas Jesus, as their high priest, also came as a human. He came prepared as a sinless, perfect sacrifice, no blemish, and offered himself so that once and for all he perfected all of God's people so that God will no longer remember their sin. They have been forgiven by the blood of Jesus. So there's this kind of unfolding logical progression of a better messenger, a better high priest, a better sacrifice. And the author really is using the old system that they would have known of to really kind of contrast and show the fullness of what Christ actually did. And then there's this option to go into this kind of better life. So there's a slightly more densely packed application section where it's okay, right, now we know all of this, now we know chapters 1 to 10. This is how it should live. This is how we should live. This is how it should affect our lives. Because we can't read, and we can't really read, the perfect messenger and the perfect high priest and the perfect sacrifice and remain unchanged. So the letter has to move in to how it should affect their lives. Now, this kind of division of this theology to application, it's not cut and dry. It's not as if the entirety of that first half of the letter is only theology, only kind of application of, only explanation of what Christ has done. It's more just generally speaking, the majority of that first section is explanation, is theology of what Christ has done. And generally speaking, the end of the letter is kind of application, how this should fit into your life. But kind of within the overarching half, the first half of the book and the kind of second half of the book, there is a wee bit of a back and forth, a wee bit of an interchange between this kind of theology, this explanation, and exhortation, kind of urging the audience to respond to Christ's sacrifice correctly. Now, this exhortation, this kind of urging for them to respond, kind of comes in two halves. And Crooksy kind of already mentioned, the very start, the first of it. There's kind of two halves. There's the warnings and these kind of dangers that are coming, and there's also these kind of invitations. So these exhortations, these urging to respond to what Christ has done, it comes as a warning and it comes as an invitation. So these warnings, the first one you kind of mentioned there is in chapter 2, kind of verses 1 to 3, and it's a real danger of neglecting. And often these warnings are linked with the word. They're linked with the message that Christ has brought and the message that the author is explaining and unfolding. So these warnings are always linked to what Christ has done. They're never standalone. It's always connected. It's always responding. And it's really showing that there are consequences when we neglect, or we walk in unbelief, or we don't mature, and we'll kind of go through them now. So there are consequences when we do certain things. So there's this danger of neglect. There's a danger of unbelief. This is linked again to doubting the word in particular. And this is also kind of linked to the danger of disobedience. So this unbelief in the disobedience portion comes as, the author is talking about Moses and how he brought them out into the wilderness, and they had to wander in the wilderness, like a whole generation died in the wilderness and never got to receive the promise of the promised land because of their disobedience. God didn't allow them in the promised land because of their disobedience, but he really explains that disobedience was rooted in unbelief. Their unbelief produced disobedience, and the consequence was they never got to enter the rest that they were promised. So there's these dangers that the author is still pulling through and applying to the audience as they read this book. It was not just for them in the wilderness, those generations previous. The author also talks about the danger of immaturity. This also is linked to this dullness in the word. So there's this comes in chapter 6. This comes within the high priest. He's the better high priest. So there's this kind of warning and response about the danger of not maturing and dulling ourselves to the word. It's interesting that this immaturity, this lack of maturity, is being dulled to the word. And there's also this danger of profaning. Now, profaning, I would kind of just describe as kind of a reverence, even just a disrespect to something that is sacred, is holy. And they say that there's a danger of profaning, and it's linked to disregarding the word. And this comes in chapter 10. This is when we really move into this application section. And then there's also a danger of refusing or rejecting. And the author makes it so clear that there are real consequences if you have heard, and yet you neglect, or you have unbelief, or you lack maturity, or you're profaning, or you're refusing to believe, just any of these things. There are real consequences, not just in the Old Covenant, but actually relevant to the audience's life, therefore relevant to our lives. And even if we look at one in particular, the danger of disobedience, it says, "Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. For the word of God is living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword, piercing to the vision of soul and of spirit, of joint and marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him with whom we must give account." And I think it's interesting because this is one of these verses that's super famous in Hebrews. And you kind of, I don't know, people just kind of know this one. Not everyone, but I feel if there's going to be a verse that you know from Hebrews, you're kind of there's that one about the word is living and active or something. But when we read it, the first word in this bit says for, therefore, it's a connection. So the author isn't just saying, the word is living and active as an encouragement to them. It's saying, the author is directly connecting the warning of disobedience rooted in unbelief to the fact that the word is living and active, sharper than a two-edged sword, etc., etc. So, my question is why? Why is the author connecting these two things, connecting this warning? They've already connected disobedience back to unbelief, and now they're connecting all of this through to the fact that the word is living and active. So kind of in this school, you're really trained to look past what you might just initially see. When I say, observation, we kind of look and we look and we look until we really start seeing. Maybe we do. We say, look, the word of God is described. There's a bit of a list it's describing, but I don't want to just stop there. I want to look and I say, this is actually connected to something else. Okay, what's it connected to? And then you go, oh, well, if we zoom back out, they've already kind of described how they ended up in disobedience. And you look and you look and you look until you really start building a more full picture of what's happening. And then you start asking why. So you're able just to get to a new depth you might not have got to if you just looked that wee bit more. So that's kind of like even just one thing that the author is connecting together, these dangers. But the warnings and also the kind of invitations all kind of come within this repetition of let us. So there's this repetition of let us. 14 times within the letter, the author says, let us. So it's not just warning, it's also invitations, but they're all in response to what Christ has done. Like when these 14 times that let us is said, never once are they stand alone. It is always, Christ has done this, therefore let us respond. You know, it is since we have such a good high priest, let us. You know, so like when we look at this, let us, because God has done this, like respond to Christ in the way that is good and appropriate and is fitting in gratitude of what he has done. You know, there's these multiple let us, and they're all there. I mean, take a picture if you like. I don't know. It's a lot of writing to do. But yeah, so there's these like 14 letters that spread throughout the whole letter. So like I said, this kind of theology to application is just this kind of larger kind of general sweep. But we can kind of see that there are like invitations to respond to what Christ has done throughout the letter, starting in 4, going all the way to the end in 13. And there are a couple of specific pieces that stand out to me within this letters, this kind of invitation. So it's like, therefore, Christ has done this beautiful explanation of Christ's sacrifice. And it's like, okay, therefore, let us. And there's a couple of real repetitions that stand out to me. And it's draw near and confidence. So draw near in the letter of Hebrews is said 6 times. And confidence is also said 5 times. And it's always kind of in the context of responding to what Christ has done. You know, it says, since then we have such, it says, let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace that we may receive mercy and find grace and help in times of need. It's like, therefore, since Christ has done what he has done, let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace and receive mercy in times when we need it. And this is like repeated, but I think it's so interesting because it would have been absolutely revolutionary. I mean, Duncan, you mentioned it. Like this mindset that they had, this fear of God, this unapproachable God that they were scared to disobey. And yet they're saying, see in your persecution, see in your suffering, this is what Christ has done. Therefore, draw near to the throne of grace and receive the mercy that you need to make it through with the Lord. And there's this like revolutionary invitation to intimacy that the author is explaining in this book. And it was only ever possible because of Christ's sacrifice. And so the author is consistently linking Christ as our high priest and our sacrifice and the result of intimacy with the Lord that is able to happen. So another question I had was why? Why is the author repeating this? Another repetition that comes up is heavenly. Heavenly is actually repeated about 13 times in the letter. Again, lots of times it's in regard to Christ. It's the heavenly tabernacle. It's the heavenly kind of high priest where like Christ is sat in the heavenlies. So there's this repetition of heaven or the heavenlies or eternal. Eternal is also repeated 6 times. It talks about eternal salvation. It talks about eternal judgment. It talks about eternal redemption, the eternal spirit, the eternal inheritance, the eternal covenant. And I just think it's interesting because it seems like the author is wanting to shift their perspective from the earthly and from the temporary to the heavenly and to the eternal. Well, forgot the word there. But they seem to, he's trying to shift their perspective, it seems. And the author is using this contrast, like they contrast the heavenly and the earthly, the eternal and the temporary. Why did the author need to shift the audience's perspective? That's kind of like, these are just slightly bigger picture interpretation questions that I was just led to by looking through the kind of bigger picture and the repeated words and themes of the book. And just considering like all we know about their situation and the persecution they were facing, the audience had two options. Like, they had the option of claiming Judaism and seeking protection in the synagogue, and that would help them endure this persecution. Or they had option 2, where they could stand firm, stay faithful to Jesus, respond to his sacrifice and the intimacy that he has opened up by drawing near to God, drawing near to the throne of grace, so they could receive his help, his grace, his mercy when they needed it most. So there's this other option of holding fast to the confession of their faith, drawing near to God and receiving his grace. So there's these two options. And, just some, bigger picture interpretation questions that I am now led to. I'm like, well, what would lead the audience to choose option 1? Because it was a real option. It was so tempting that the author needed to write this book. So it was tempting to them. Like, what would lead them to draw, like, the option 1? What would stop them from drawing near to God? Like, did the audience have a full understanding of what God had done for them? Like, did they know the fullness of what Jesus was offering them now and into eternity? Because this is the whole message, the whole reason that the book was read. Like, I don't think they did, because they could have been choosing option 1, and the author is like, no. Like, once you know, like, once you really know, like, you need to choose option 2. It should be the only response once we know what Christ has done. So we can kind of start interpreting like their situation and why they would have been doing what they were doing, or why the author needed to write what they did. We can start asking questions about God. Like, what does this reveal about his character that he would do this? Like, when you read Hebrews and when you read the plan that God has had for the fullness of time and what Christ did, like, for the result that it gave, the intimacy that it gave God's children to approach him, you're like, what does this reveal about you? Like, it's outrageous. So we can interpret through that lens and be like, no, like, God, I have looked and I have looked and I have looked, and I am overwhelmed by what you have what you have done. Like, what does this reveal about you? We can interpret through that perspective. So we can look at all these different things, and we can ask all these different things. But we never want to just leave it with them. Like, I never want to leave it with them. We're not Jews, we're not facing persecution. But like, there are aspects of their situation that bleed into mine. There are timeless truths from this book that were true to them, real to them, that should have transformed their situation, that should transform mine. So, when I think about it, I'm like, well, what is my option 1? What is my option rather than turning to God and drawing near to him? Like, I need to identify that in my own life. I need to ask why. Like, why am I turning to that? Like, what is my earthly perspective? What is my temporary perspective? Because I know I should be looking at the heavenlies. I know I should be looking at the eternal. I know I should be looking at the truth of what you've done and the openness that you have now given me through that. Like, that should be affecting my situation. Do I actually have do I have a fullness of understanding of actually, like, what is available to me? And, or why don't I? And I need to read Hebrews again, clearly. I need to, if I don't have I'll just keep reading until the Spirit just keeps revealing the fullness of this, so that it deeply transforms my my options in front of me and my choices, so that this has transformed my mind and my heart, where I cannot choose option one. Like, I can only choose drawing near to God, because I know that's where the fullness of life that the author is describing is found. So, Hebrews is just this beautiful unveiling of how Christ fulfilled the promises that God had made, like the covenants that God had promised his people like so long ago. Like, it's this beautiful unveiling of the fulfillment. And I think a real summarized, simplified summary of the book of Hebrews, it just is like that Jesus Christ and the Christian life are better than Judaism's shadows, because the blessings that we receive are eternal and forever, and they give us perfect standing in the heavenlies before God. We are perfect before God in the heavenlies because of what Christ has done, so we can draw near to him, and Jesus is our pioneer who's gone before us. So just this little summary of the book. I don't know how you summarize Hebrews, but I've tried my best. But yeah, so it's just this, Hebrews is this explanation and invitation to intimacy and dependency and relationship with God. It explains our standing before him, how God views us in light of what Christ has done, not what we have done. And honestly, Hebrews leaves me thinking, how could I believe in anything else? If this is the life that Christ has won for me, how could I live any other way? And this is how I leave Hebrews. But, it's a journey to go through the book and to see the fullness of it, the big picture of it, the audience, and, why it was written and how it was written, and just to be able to get to that depth of where it's just challenges, and yet such a comforting invitation that is offered. So this is slightly similar to what a normal kind of Tuesday night class would be. There's kind of the assumption that maybe not all of us have read Hebrews before recently. When you would come to class, you would have read the book already. You would have kind of started your observation journey. So you might know a little bit more. You might have seen a little bit more before you would have come to class. But this is quite similar, where we really do try and set you up with big picture ideas, really getting into the mindset, so you're so equipped to really see and look at what's significant, and really kind of think through the lens of the kind of mindset of the audience at the time. And this is kind of what you would be. This is what Tuesday night would be. I also have some kind of charts. So I've got them here. So there's A4 sheets of paper. So at the end, please come, I'll spread them out and you can have a wee look at them, because that's kind of what our homework would be. So the homework would be, there was kind of a class like this, you'd be really equipped to be able to go away and to look and observe, interpret and apply. And kind of how that's actually laid out on paper, just so it's a little bit less abstract. I've kind of got some examples here. I charted Hebrews. I kind of studied Hebrews inductively. So yeah, that's kind of what the homework would look like, the kind of 3 steps of the observation that you would be doing. Throughout the first few weeks of the class, you would be really equipped, in the method. That would be really kind of a bit more kind of coachy, so we would kind of go through the steps and really help you, so you would feel really confident to be able to go away and kind of do it on your own. So that would kind of be how we start off, to the point where, you could just get the kind of homework to that kind of point where you're able to kind of observe it and interpret and apply. So that's kind of there, so you can have a wee look. The idea and the envision is that it's about 10 hours a week, kind of of just homework alongside your kind of normal life commitments. And I kind of said at the start, it's a 3-year school, and that first year we go through the majority of the New Testament. But we've got 4 weeks before it starts. There is still some space in the school. So for any reason, if you're sat here going, oh, this is really interesting me, I'd really love to kind of do this, but you're just not sure if you'd be able to fully commit to the 3 years, but you're I'd like a taste, I'd like to commit even just for 1 year and kind of see what happens, whether you're going to be in Glasgow for that whole time or whatever your specific reason is. If you want to like chat to me specifically more about that, I'd love to speak to you. So even if you're sat here going, oh, I could definitely do a year, then please do speak to me. There's kind of space and opportunity for the school for you to do that, and you get like the fullness of the New Testament. But yes, the school starts on September 12th, so 4 weeks today. The deadline for the application is the 31st of August, and like kind of per month, the cost of the school is like £199. So per month you would start in that like the September, the first year, the first month, and then you would go through to the last month in the third year. So I mean, it really, like, the school is a real cost, like not just financially, but like, you know, time and effort. Like, it absolutely is. But I mean, I think the question to ask is like, is the fruit that would come from this school worth it? You know, because I can say, like, I, you know, 5-6 years ago invested 9 months, like I just did this full time, you know, so I invested the time, the money, the effort into it, and it has absolutely transformed like my life, the confidence I have in the Word, the way that I know God because of my relationship with the Word has, you know, it has eternal purpose and eternal significance. And I can absolutely say for my life personally, the fruit was worth like the cost and the effort that it was needed. And I just have absolutely no doubt that anyone who does this school, would be equipped to read and study and apply the Word into your life. I just feel like this school should come with a warning. Like, you will be transformed. Like, are you ready? You know, but yeah, you will know the Lord more. It comes with a warning. Like, you will know the Lord more. You will be transformed. And personally in my life, I can say it was worth the cost that it took. And yeah, if you have any questions, want to chat to me more, please do grab me. We're finishing a wee touch early, but I'll leave these, I'll pop these up, I'll pop them around so you can have a wee bit of an idea of what the homework would actually be. Does anyone have any questions specifically that you're like, I'm thinking this, I think everyone in the room's thinking this? Amazing. If you've got any questions you just like to ask me personally, that's absolutely fine. I'll be here for a wee bit. I think I'll just pray, and then we can finish up. So yeah, Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for tonight. I thank you for your word. I thank you for the life and the truth that it contains, Lord. And yeah, I just pray that we walk away tonight and we feel hungry for your word. That you stir in us a hunger, and you grow confidence in us that we can read this book and really understand who you are, understand what you've done, and understand how you want it to change our lives and our hearts and how we see you and how we know you and our relationship with you. So yeah, Lord, I thank you for all the ways that you have spoken to us. And Lord, I pray that, you continue to speak to us through the word, through this book. And yeah, Lord, I just thank you that you have made a way for us to know you. In Jesus' name, amen. Amazing.